The title of my comments, The Contribution to Mental Health Reform by People Who Have Experienced Mental Health Challenges, is one I was asked to speak about, but it's one I also cherish speaking about. It's one that's very near and dear to my heart. If I could give it to you in a nutshell, the gist of my comments, so it's a preview of coming attractions. Mental health has been under reform or in reform since the 1950s. This is not a new topic. It's one we've been struggling with since before I was born and before many of you were born. And some of those reforms have succeeded and many of those reforms have failed. And I'll give you a brief snapshot of where I think we are now. But my comments, the purpose or the reason for this title is the gist of my comments will be that while there are things that commissioners and practitioners can do to make mental health services of a higher quality and of more effectiveness, the bulk of the responsibility for changing mental health practice actually falls on service users and carers. You are the ones who actually have the power to make changes that practitioners have not been able to make for over 50 years. Now we're getting towards 70 years almost. So that's why this topic and this title. This is a picture from a mental hospital in Italy from 1961. It's one of many such pictures. If you haven't seen them before, they're quite accessible on the internet or in textbooks, abnormal psychology textbooks or community mental health textbooks. And I'm showing you this not to remind you of how terrible things were prior to the 1950 reforms and the reason for the reforms, but to remind you that this is what we used to think mental ill health, sorry, it's not something I'm used to using, mental ill health, mental illness looked like. We thought that people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other psychotic disorders and chronic depression, we thought that they could not take care of themselves, that the illness took over the entirety of the person and they were incapacitated. And we thought that because they were incapacitated by this illness that was not going to go away, but if anything was going to get worse, we had people in hospitals. So we thought that this was what the illness did to people, and therefore people needed to be in hospitals. What we've now learned since the 1970s is that this is not mental illness, but this is institutionalization. This is the effects of the hospital in combination with the illness. And we've decided globally that we should no longer keep people in hospitals because of the devastating effects that institutions have on people's rights and their opportunities and the quality of their lives. What we haven't done yet is to welcome these folks into the communities to which they come when they left hospitals. My father worked for his career at AT&T, which is had been a long-standing telephone company for the United States. And I was in his house at one point recently Skyping with Anthony. So I had my computer and we were talking. He was in Melbourne, I was in Georgia, we were talking. My father walked in the room and he looked and he said, "You know, that's really amazing. It's really amazing that you can talk to someone on the other side of the world in real time and see him and he sees you. It's just amazing." I thought, it really is amazing. If you stop and think about it, it's pretty incredible. He said, "Yeah, I remember back in the 1960s when the boys at Bell Labs," which is what they called scientists, I guess, in the 60s, the boys at Bell Labs told us that there would be a day when you would be able to see the person you were talking to on the phone. And we thought they were crazy. And here it is, 60 years later, but here it is. What is my point? My point is, well, and one other piece of this. So I went back and I did a little history, did a little search of history to see, in fact, when the boys at Bell Labs had discovered this potential. And what I found out is that it was 1978 when the first wireless telephone was invented. And it was huge. It was like this big. There's a picture I have of the guy holding it up to his head. It's about this big. So they invented wireless connectivity in 1978, and it's taken now 50 years, almost 50 years, to get from there to the iPhone. I don't have mine on me, but you know what I'm talking about. My point in going through this little historical story is that we are at the beginning of the recovery movement, not at the end. And we have realized that people with serious mental illnesses can be disconnected from hospitals. They don't have to be in hospitals, and in fact, hospitals, for the most part, are damaging rather than therapeutic or curative or whatever you want to call it. But we have a long way to go. We have at least a generation or two before we're going to realize a vision of mental health care that's substantially, significantly different from what we have today. People with mental illnesses want the same things out of life as everybody else does. They're not their diagnoses. They're not subsumed entirely by the illness. The person continues to exist alongside of the illness. And unfortunately, mental health care has not focused much on that person and his or her wishes for a meaningful everyday life. And that's what the service user movement has told us, is people want a life. They don't just want to be a fine patient. That's a major focus right now in the US is internalized stigma, is helping people to cough back up everything they've learned about themselves that's not been true, so that they have the self-credibility and then the credibility from others. Actually, you get credibility with yourself through getting credibility with other people. It's hard to pull yourself up alone. It really requires other people. So I will, thank you, I'll add that to that list. So we have a home, a meaningful way to spend your time, like an occupation. Doesn't have to be paid, but it's nice if it is. You need friends, you need a sense of belonging, you need a connection to a higher power, you need credibility with other people, and you need sex. I don't want to lose the sex part. And why do I not want to lose it? Because the recovery movement has been all about affording people their basic sense of dignity as a person, as a human being. And sex is important to most human beings. We don't talk about it much in civil circumstances like this. But I raise it in part because of that, because we haven't talked about sex and mental health. We've acted as if someone with a serious mental illness all of a sudden becomes asexual. And some of the medications actually drive people toward becoming asexual. But that's not a happy place to be. Nobody chooses that willingly. So in a recovery-oriented system of care, we pay a lot of attention to whether people are looking for romantic partners or sexual partners and how we can facilitate their access to that. Doesn't mean that we go to bed with our clients. I'm not suggesting that. There are boundaries, and those boundaries are important to protect people from exploitation. But we don't ignore the fact that we are sexual beings or that we are spiritual beings, as we have historically in mental health. I want to go back to this. I'm going to suggest to you that there are people, and you know them, so I'm not saying I'm not saying anything controversial. There are people out there who profess not to have a mental illness or an addiction, and who will deny having a mental illness or an addiction in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. And there are researchers who say that this is based on a deficit in the brain, and that's part of the illness. And that's a popular view. And it's a popular view that justifies things like community treatment orders and involuntary commitment and involuntary treatment. But I am suggesting to you today that that is a legacy of a history just like this is. That if you're brought up in a society in which mental illness is understood to be axe murderers and serial killers and Frankenstein's monster, why would you ever say, yes, I have one? Because that's not what mental illnesses are. I'm just a person, just like everybody else. And I'm speaking from firsthand experience. I was already a PhD psychologist, faculty member at Yale University, happily married with 2 children and 2 dogs, when I realized that I'd had an untreated mental illness for 17 years. Because after all, I thought mental illnesses only happened to other people. Because that's what I'd been taught. I had textbooks in college and in graduate school that showed me pictures like this, and I was told that's mental illness. Well, that's not me. So why would I say, yes, I have an illness if that's what the illness looks like? So we don't know whether denial and lack of insight or awareness is part of the illness, or if it's a legacy of the discrimination and stigma that we continue to have with these illnesses in our society. We have taught people, or not taught actually, that's the problem. We haven't taught people. What we've allowed to have happen is stereotypes and misunderstandings of mental illness and addiction to permeate our society so that when a young person starts to have difficulties like that, that's the last thing they think. No, I'm not an addict. No, I'm not a mental patient. I'm just a person who's having weird experiences, or I'm just a person who's having difficulty. And when we come at them and say, you have an illness we call schizophrenia, and you'll have it for the entirety of your life, and you'll never get married, and you'll never have a career, and you'll never be able to live independently, who in their right mind, that's a pun, would say, oh, okay, thank you very much. You'd have to be crazy to accept the label of being mentally ill. The major point I was asked to make, which is that patients need to be leaders of the reform. But it's been a bone of contention, and I assume it's true in Australia as well, that mental health care and addiction treatment, for that matter, has never been adequately funded. But what we haven't done, or what you haven't done, is go to your legislators, or your commissioners, or your prime minister, and say, we need services. But it can't be 1 or 2 or 6 or 12 people. It has to be hundreds of people, thousands of people. The civil rights movement relied heavily on marches of hundreds of thousands of people. I'm not suggesting that you start organizing marches. I think that decade is over. But I am suggesting that you need to have a collective voice. One of the complaints policymakers have about service user and family members is they don't speak with one voice. So who am I supposed to listen to? You have to have a collective voice. Carers have to get together with service users. You have to become a political lobby, and you have to say, we vote. And I'm not suggesting by standing down here that it's easy. Don't take me to mean that this is easy and you're at fault for not doing it better, more, or whatever. I'm just trying to encourage you that this is the time. People like Janet have been doing this for God knows how long. Anthony's been doing it. I know people get tired. I get tired too. But this is the time for advocacy.